Good morning, everyone. We are going to start with chapter 5 of a series of unfortunate events, The Wide Window. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny. By the time you read this note, my life will be at its end. My heart is as cold as Ike, and I find life unbearable. I know your children may not understand the sad life of a dowager, or what would have leaded me to this desperate act, but please know that I am much happier this way. As my last will and testament, I leave you three in the care of Captain Sham, a kind and honorable man. Please think of me kindly, even though I had done this terrible thing. Your Aunt Josephine. Stop it, Violet cried. Stop reading it out loud, Klaus. We already know what it says. I just can't believe it, Klaus said, turning the paper around for the umpteenth time. The Baudelaire orphans were sitting glumly around the dining room table with the cold lime stew in bowls and dread in their hearts. Violet had called Mr. Poe and told him what had happened, and the Baudelaires, too anxious to sleep, had stayed up the whole night waiting for him to arrive on the first fickle ferry of the day. The candles were almost completely burned down, and Klaus had to lean forward to read Josephine's note. There's something funny about this note, but I can't put my finger on it. How can you say such a thing? Violet asked. Aunt Josephine has thrown herself out the window. There's nothing funny about it at all. Not funny as in a funny joke, Klaus said. Funny as in a funny smell. Why, in the very first sentence she says, my life will be at its end. And now it is, Violet said, shuddering. That's not what I mean, Klaus said impatiently. She uses its, it', which always means it is. But you wouldn't say my life will be at it is end. She means its, belonging to. He picked up Captain Sham's business card, which was still lying on the table. Remember when she saw this card? Every boat has its own sail. She said it was a serious grammatical error. Who cares about grammatical errors, Violet asked, when Aunt Josephine has jumped out the window? But Aunt Josephine would have cared, Klaus pointed out. That's what she cared about most. Grammar. Remember, she said it was the greatest joy in life. Well, it wasn't enough, Violet said sadly. No matter how much she liked grammar, it says she found her life unbearable. But that's another error in the note, Klaus said. It doesn't say unbearable with a U. It says inbearable with an I. You are being unbearable with a U, Violet cried. And you are being stupid with an S, Klaus snapped. Agate! Sunny shrieked, which meant something along the lines of, please stop fighting. Violet and Klaus looked at their baby sister and then at one another. Oftentimes, when people are miserable, they will want to make other people miserable too, but it never helps. I'm sorry, Klaus, Violet said meekly. You're not unbearable. Our situation is unbearable. I know, Klaus said miserably. I'm sorry, too. You're not stupid, Violet. You're very clever. In fact, I hope you're clever enough to get us out of the situation. Aunt Josephine has jumped out the window and left us in the care of Captain Sham, and I don't know what we can do about it. Well, Mr. Poe is on his way, Violet said. He said on the phone that he would be here first thing in the morning, so we don't have long to wait. Maybe Mr. Poe can be of some help. I guess so, Klaus said, but he and his sisters looked at one another and sighed. They knew that the chances of Mr. Poe being of much help were rather slim. When the Baudelaires lived with Count Olaf, Mr. Poe was not helpful when the children told him about Count Olaf's cruelty. When the Baudelaires lived with Uncle Monty, Mr. Poe was not helpful when the children told him about Count Olaf's treachery. It seemed clear that Mr. Poe would not be of any help in this situation either. One of the candles burned out in a small puff of smoke. The children sank lower in their chairs. You probably know of a plant called the Venus flytrap, which grows in the tropics. The top of the plant is shaped like an open mouth. with tooth-like spines around the edges. When a fly, attracted by the smell of the flower, lands on the Venus flytrap, the mouth of the plant begins to close, trapping the fly. The terrified fly buzzes around the closed mouth of the plant, but there is nothing it can do, and the plant slowly dissolves the fly into nothing. As the darkness of the house closed in around them, the Baudelaire youngsters felt like the fly in this situation. It was as if the disastrous fire that took the lives of their parents had been the beginning of a trap, and they hadn't even known it. They buzzed from place to place: Count Olaf's house in the city, Uncle Monty's home in the country, and now Aunt Josephine's house overlooking the lake. But their own misfortune always closed around them, tighter and tighter, and it seemed to the three siblings that before too long they would dissolve away to nothing. "We could rip up the note," Klaus said finally. "Then Mr. Poe wouldn't know about Aunt Josephine's wishes, and we wouldn't end up with Captain Sham." "But I already told Mr. Poe that Aunt Josephine left a note," Violet said. "Well, we could do a forgery," Klaus said, using a word which here means write something yourself and pretend somebody else wrote it. "We'll write everything she wrote, but we'll leave out the part about Captain Sham." "Aha!" Sunny shrieked. This word was a favorite of Sunny's, and unlike most of her words, it needed no translation. What Sunny meant was "aha!" an expression of discovery. "Of course!" Violet cried. "That's what Captain Sham did. He wrote this letter, not Aunt Josephine." Behind his glasses, Klaus's eyes lit up. "That explains it." "That explains unbearable," Violet said. "Leap!" Sunny shrieked, which probably meant Captain Sham threw Aunt Josephine out the window and then wrote this note to hide his crime. "What a terrible thing to do," Klaus said, shuddering as he thought of Aunt Josephine falling into the lake she feared so much. "Imagine the terrible things he will do to us," Violet said, "if we don't expose his crime. I can't wait until Mr. Poe gets here so we can tell him what happened." With perfect timing, the doorbell rang, and the Baudelaires hurried to answer it. Violet led her siblings down the hallway, looking wistfully at the radiator as she remembered how afraid of it Aunt Josephine was. Klaus followed closely behind, touching each doorknob gently in memory of Aunt Josephine's warning about them shattering into pieces. And when they reached the door, Sunny looked mournfully at the welcome mat that Aunt Josephine thought would cause someone to break their neck. Aunt Josephine had been so careful to avoid anything that she thought might harm her, but harm had still come her way. Violet opened the peeling white door, and there stood Mr. Poe in the gloomy light of dawn. "Mr. Poe," Violet said. She intended to tell him immediately of their forgery theory, but as soon as she saw him standing in the doorway with a white handkerchief in one hand and a black briefcase in the other, her words stuck in her throat. Tears are curious things, for like earthquakes or puppet shows, they can occur at any time, without any warning and without any good reason. "Mr. Poe," Violet said again, and without any warning, she and her siblings burst into tears. Violet cried, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and Klaus cried, tears making his glasses slip down his nose, and Sunny cried, her open mouth revealing her 4 teeth. Mr. Poe put down his briefcase and put away his handkerchief. He was not very good at comforting people, but he put his arms around the children the best he could and murmured, there, which is a phrase some people murmur to comfort other people despite the fact that it doesn't really mean anything. Mr. Poe couldn't think of anything else to say that might have comforted the Baudelaire orphans, but I wish now that I had had the power to go back in time and speak to these 3 sobbing children. If I could tell the Baudelaires that, like earthquakes and puppet shows, their tears were occurring not only without warning, but without good reason. The youngsters were crying, of course, but because they thought Aunt Josephine was dead, and I wish that I had the power to go back and tell them that they were wrong. But of course, I cannot. I am not on top of the hill overlooking Lake Lacamorose on that gloomy evening. I am sitting in my room in the middle of the night, writing down the story and looking out my window at the graveyard behind my home. I cannot tell the Baudelaire orphans that they are wrong, but I can tell you, as the orphans cry in Mr. Poe's arms, that Aunt Josephine is not dead. Not yet. Chapter 6. Mr. Poe frowned, sat down at the table, and took out his handkerchief. Forgery, he repeated. The Baudelaire orphans had shown him the shattered window in the library. They had shown him the note that had been thumbtacked to the door, and they had shown him the business card with the grammatical mistake on it. Forgery is a very serious charge, he said sternly, and blew his nose. Not as serious as murder, Klaus pointed out, and that's what Captain Sham did. He murdered Aunt Josephine and forged a note. But why would this Captain Sham person, Mr. Poe asked, go to all this trouble just to place you under his care? We've already told you, Violet said, trying to hide her impatience. Captain Sham is really Count Olaf in disguise. These are very serious accusations, Mr. Poe said firmly. I understand that the three of you have had some terrible experiences, and I hope you're not letting your imagination get the best of you. Remember when you lived with Uncle Monty? You were convinced that his assistant, Stefano, was really Count Olaf in disguise. But Stefano was Count Olaf in disguise, Klaus exclaimed. That's not the point, Mr. Poe said. The point is that you can't jump to conclusions. If you really think this note is a forgery, then we have to stop talking about disguises and do an investigation. Somewhere in this house, I'm sure we can find something that your Aunt Josephine has written. We can compare the handwriting and see if this note matches up. The Baudelaire orphans looked at one another. Of course, Klaus said. If the note we found on the library door doesn't match Aunt Josephine's handwriting, then it was obviously written by someone else. We didn't think of that. Mr. Poe smiled. You see, you are very intelligent children, but even the most intelligent people in the world often need the help of a banker. Now, where can we find a sample of Aunt Josephine's handwriting? In the kitchen, Violet said promptly. She left her shopping list in the kitchen when we got home from the market. Judy! Sonny shrieked, which probably meant, let's go to the kitchen and get it. And that's exactly what they did. Aunt Josephine's kitchen was very small and had a large white sheet covering the stove and the oven. For safety, Aunt Josephine had explained during her tour. There was a countertop where she prepared the food, a refrigerator where she stored the food, and a sink where she washed away the food nobody had eaten. To one side of the countertop was a small piece of paper on which Aunt Josephine had made her list, and Violet crossed the kitchen to retrieve it. Mr. Poe turned on the lights, and Violet held the shopping list up to the note to see if they matched. There are men and women who are experts in the field of handwriting analysis. They are called graphologists, and they attend graphological schools in order to get their degree on graphology. You might think that this situation would call for a graphologist, but there are times when an expert's opinion is unnecessary. For instance, if a friend of yours brought you her pet dog and said she was concerned because it wasn't laying eggs, you would not have to be a veterinarian to tell her that dogs do not lay eggs, and so there is nothing to worry about. Yes, there are some questions that are so simple that anyone can answer them, and Mr. Poe and the Baudelaire orphans instantly knew the answer to the question. Does the handwriting on the shopping list match the handwriting on the note? The answer was yes. When Aunt Josephine had written vinegar on the shopping list, she had curved the tips of the V into tiny spirals, the same spirals that decorated the tips of the V in violet on the note. When she had written cucumbers on the shopping list, the C's were slightly squiggly like earthworms, and the same earthworms appeared in the words cold and Captain Sham on the note. When Aunt Josephine had written limes on the shopping list, the I was dotted with an oval rather than a circle, just as it was in My Life Will Be at Its End. There was no doubt that Aunt Josephine had written on both pieces of paper that Mr. Poe and the Baudelaires were examining. I don't think there's any doubt that Aunt Josephine wrote on both pieces of paper, Mr. Poe said. But, Violet began. There are no buts about it, Mr. Poe said. Look at the curvy V's. Look at the squiggly C's. Look at the oval dots over the I's. I am no graphologist, but I can certainly tell that these were written by the same person. You're right, Klaus said miserably. I know that Captain Sham is behind this somehow, but Aunt Josephine definitely wrote this note. And that, Mr. Poe said, makes it a legal document. Does that mean we have to live with Captain Sham? Violet asked, her heart sinking. I am afraid so, Mr. Poe replied. Someone's last will and testament is an official statement of wishes of the deceased. You were placed in Aunt Josephine's care, so she had the right to assign you to a new caretaker before she leaped out the window. It is very shocking, certainly, but it is entirely legal. We won't go live with him, Klaus said fiercely. He's the worst person on earth. He'll do something terrible, I know it, Violet said. All he's after is the Baudelaire fortune. Gained! Sunny shrieked, which meant something like, please don't make us live with this evil man. I know you don't like this Captain Sham person, Mr. Poe said, but there's not much I can do about it. I'm afraid the law says that's where you'll go. We'll run away, Klaus said. You will do nothing of the kind, Mr. Poe said sternly. Your parents entrusted me to see that you would be cared for properly. You want to honor your parents' wishes, don't you? Well, yes, Violet said, but then please don't make a fuss, Mr. Poe said. Think of what your poor mother and father would say if they knew you were threatening to run away from your guardian. The Baudelaire parents, of course, would have been horrified to learn that their children were to be in the care of Captain Sham. But before the children could say this to Mr. Poe, he moved on to other matters. Now, I think the easiest thing to do would be to meet with Captain Sham and go over some details. Where is his business card? I'll phone him now. On the table in the dining room, Klaus said glumly, and Mr. Poe left the kitchen to make the call. The Baudelaires looked at Aunt Josephine's shopping list and the suicide note. I just can't believe it, Violet said. I was sure we were on the right track with the forgery idea. Me too, Klaus said. Captain Sham has done something here. I know he has, but he's been even sneakier than usual. We'd better be smarter than usual then, Violet replied, because we have got to convince Mr. Poe before it's too late. Well, Mr. Poe said he had to go over some details, Klaus said. Perhaps that will take a long time. I got a hold of Captain Sham, Mr. Poe said, coming back into the kitchen. He was shocked to hear of Aunt Josephine's death, but overjoyed at the prospect of raising you children. We're meeting him in a half hour for lunch at a restaurant in town, and after lunch we'll go over the details of your adoption. By tonight you should be staying in his house. I'm sure you're relieved that this can be sorted out so quickly. Violet and Sunny stared at Mr. Poe, too dismayed to speak. Klaus was silent too, but he was staring hard at something else. He was staring at Josephine's note. His eyes were focused in concentration behind his glasses as he stared and stared at it without blinking. Mr. Poe took his white handkerchief out of his pocket and coughed into it at great length and with great gusto, a word which here means in a way which produces a great deal of phlegm. But none of the Baudelaires said a word. Well, Mr. Poe said finally, I will call for a taxi cab. There's no use walking down the enormous hill. You children comb your hair and put your coats on. It's very windy out and it's getting cold. I think a storm might be approaching. Mr. Poe left to make his phone call, and the Baudelaires trudged to their room. Rather than comb their hair, however, Sunny and Violet immediately turned to Klaus. What? Violet asked him. What? Klaus answered. Don't give me that what, Violet answered. You figured something out. That's what. I know you have. You've been rereading Aunt Josephine's note for the umpteenth time, but you had an expression as if you had just figured something out. Now, what is it? I'm not sure, Klaus said, looking over the note one more time. I might have begun figuring something out, something that could help us, but I need more time. We don't have any time, Violet cried. We're going to have lunch with Captain Sham right now. Then we're going to have to make some more time, somehow, Klaus said determinedly. Come on, children, Mr. Poe called from the hallway. The cab will be here any minute. Get your coats and let's go. Violet sighed, but went to the closet and took out all 3 Baudelaire coats. She handed Klaus his coat and buttoned Sunny up into her coat as she talked to her brother. How can we make more time? Violet asked. You're the inventor, Klaus answered, buttoning his coat. But you can't invent things like time, Violet said. You can invent things like automatic popcorn poppers. You can invent things like steam-powered window washers, but you can't invent more time. Violet was so certain she couldn't invent more time that she didn't even put her hair up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. She merely gave Klaus a look of frustration and confusion and started to put on her coat. But as she did up the buttons, she realized she didn't even need to put her hair up in a ribbon because the answer was right with her. And that's all we will read today. I hope you guys have a fantastic afternoon, and I will see you all tomorrow.